Dave, there are a number of things we want to get to with you, but we were reconnected after you wrote an op-ed entitled America Must Lead on cryptocurrency. And, you know, it was somewhat interesting to see the former CEO of the world's largest hedge fund take a pro-crypto view, given how reticent the financial industry has been in adopting crypto. Why is this a platform that's important to you?
Well, thanks for having me. Nice to see both of you. The reason that I advocated this is I think it's good economic policy, but it's also good national security policy. And I've obviously been following crypto for a while now and the developments around blockchain. And I always thought it had appeal as around the principles of individual freedom and privacy. You know, data security, data privacy is something that is incredibly important and increasingly so. But I was always worried about the national security implications. And I think what's become clear is that we are in the next great wave of innovation with crypto and blockchain. And if America doesn't embrace it, we're going to be left behind. And by embracing it, we can create great jobs, a great source of innovation. I've lived through a number of waves of innovation, whether it was the PC and the internet, or whether it's some of the new developments around AI. This is one such wave that we need to embrace. And the national security implications of this are clear, which is that blockchain has very limited, and crypto, very limited illicit activity, something like 0.345% of the transactions. But it gives a roadmap for national security officials and prosecutors to zero in on illicit activity. So the national security and legal experts I talk to think that that it offers a real source of eliminating, not increasing illicit activity. And so for all those reasons, and important to Pennsylvania, a job creation engine for Pennsylvania, I've embraced this and encouraged lawmakers to lay out a regulatory framework that will allow innovation to continue.
Well, it's interesting. Dave, welcome. It's Joe Matthew in Washington, and great to see you. As we consider this, you point out in your op-ed that this is also a matter of staying competitive with, if not beating China when it comes to crypto. And I wonder if we could get to the matter of China right off the top, because we have a lot of questions for you on the economy, on taxes and tariffs. Your opponent in your Senate race, Bob Casey, has pointed out repeatedly the role that you had at Bridgewater in directing investments toward companies based in China. Can you tell our listeners and viewers the extent to which you were personally involved and the effort behind those investments, how you see them now?
Sure. Well, I've been very involved with China for more than 20 years as a policymaker. In the Bush administration, I was one of the folks that was very involved in making sure that China didn't either steal or get access to some of our key technologies. And as the global economy has evolved and as China's evolved, it's become more and more of a national security threat, particularly with the rise of President Xi, who has a very aggressive view of China's role in the world vis-a-vis the United States. With regard to Bridgewater, Bridgewater is a global investment firm. We serve global clients while I was there and still. And in Bridgewater's portfolio, there was something like 2% of its allocation that was devoted to China. And that was mostly in portfolio types of investments. And so this is one of the challenges as we think about national security going forward. One of the things I've advocated is we need to make sure that investors are not investing of any kind, are not investing in companies that support the Chinese military, support the PLA, support the Communist Party. And the government should take a much more active role, and I've said this in testimony and so forth, to identify which companies we do not want American investors or American companies to invest in. And that's one of the things I'd be advocating as a senator, as well as decoupling in key industries that are going to be absolutely critical to America's economic and national security going forward. So that's the vision that I've laid out, and I think what's going to be required. And I honestly think my experience with China, both as a national security official, but also as a global CEO, is going to help me be much more sophisticated in how we deal with the Chinese, because I actually know what I'm talking about.
Dave, you know, to that end, I want to get your view here on the tariff policies put forth during Donald Trump and his presidential run. There are a lot of mainstream economists, including Larry Summers, concerned about the inflationary impact that such policies could have. Do you share those concerns?
Well, listen, I was someone who has been generally skeptical of tariffs. But when President Trump came into office, I thought that selective use of tariffs to ensure a fair playing field, ensure reciprocity, ensure negotiating leverage made sense. And so I supported the tariffs that President Trump put in place under the last administration. And I do think that there's the risk of inflationary impact. And frankly, I think there's two dimensions of President Biden's policies which are relevant to this. One is the enormous spending is the primary driver of inflation. That and the policies that are directed on reducing oil and gas consumption. Those are the primary drivers of inflation. And economists like Larry Summers have said as much. The second problem with those policies of the Biden administration, particularly as it relates to EVs and solar panels and so forth, the policies that have been in place have made us, ironically, highly dependent on China, because 70% of the lithium batteries and 80% of the solar panels are manufactured in China. So in one fell swoop, in my opinion, the Biden administration's economic agenda has driven up inflation and made us more dependent on our primary adversary. And that's why, as I've run for the Senate, I've advocated a set of policies that take us in the opposite direction.
Let's put a finer point on this, Dave. The idea of tariffs here against China we'll put aside for a second, because Donald Trump is also proposing an across-the-board, a global 10% tariff that he says would help to pay for tax cuts if he's reelected. This has been a big debate, as I'm sure you well know, in Washington over the past week or so, and it's about to get a lot louder, making permanent the 2017 tax cuts that are set to expire next year. We saw a new analysis from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget says that would cost in excess of $4 trillion, that it could add that much to our deficit. So if it's not tariffs that offset the cost here, how do you pay for it?
Well, first of all, you got to pay for it with a growing economy that's generating tax proceeds. The best way to do this, and in the Bush, or rather the Trump tax cuts, if President Biden's reelected and those tax cuts are allowed to expire, that's going to hurt all Americans. So if you look at someone who's making $70,000 a year, the impact on them is something like $2,000 of tax reduction benefit that they lose. And this is the
thing. But the impact of inflation is pretty great on a household as well, right? How do you find $4.6 trillion, I think is the number that they put down here, to pay for that without stoking inflation even further?
The inflation's already been stoked by $6 trillion of incremental spending under President Biden.
So you'd add another four.
No. The primary driver of the inflation we had has been the spending policies of Biden, and Republicans and Democrats have been spending too much. I'm not saying this is solely Democrats, but what's happened under Biden is $6 trillion of spending. And if you think about the types of spending, you can talk about $170 billion of loan forgiveness, which is absolutely, in my opinion, un-American and unfair, or you can talk about tax cuts that are going to benefit all Americans and all Pennsylvanians. And absolutely, inflation is the most regressive tax at all. So we've got to get inflation under control. But the drivers of inflation are bad energy policy that have driven up the prices of fuel and too much spending. And so I would say reversing certainly some of those Biden spending bills and rolling back the war on natural gas and fossil fuels is the key to getting our economy back in check. And I wouldn't, particularly now when so many families are burdened by this inflation, I wouldn't burden them further by rolling back the tax cuts that President Trump put in place.
Speaking of burdens on families, when you think about the deficit issue largely in the U.S., does that mean that you've also ruled out the idea of more spending, or slowing spending rather, on Medicare and Social Security to be part of the solution in closing that gap?
Well, I think the primary thing we need to do now is roll back some of the spending that President Biden has put in place. Again, I keep pointing to it because it's such an obvious one, is the $168 billion of most recent student loan forgiveness. I mean, look at that. It's extraordinary. That's the size of the Army's budget. That kind of spending doesn't make sense to most Americans. So we got to roll back that spending. We've got to attack a number of sources of discretionary spending. And certainly when you look down the road, there's questions around entitlements. But the basic premise there you have to start with is we have to live up to the obligations that we promise people. And so it's a balancing act for sure, but a pro-growth economic agenda that deregulates, that allows businesses to grow, is going to be the primary driver of driving tax receipts. We've got to drive back or pull back on spending. I certainly agree with that. But the starting point has to be the war on oil and gas, which has hindered us dramatically, and some of the Biden priorities, which I honestly think are indefensible. And the most notable one is the student loan forgiveness.
Well, we should note, I realize that you're speaking in some cases here about the moratorium on new LNG permits, but the United States is pumping more oil than it has ever in history right now. Dave, I want to ask you about your policy or your proposals if you're elected on Israel. I'd like to get to Israel if we can here to try to get to as many topics as we can. Dave, there are a lot of questions about whether we're going to see a ceasefire at any point soon. And I wonder if you think that Israel should declare war on Hezbollah, if that is in fact the mission here for Israel, to combat the influence of Iranian proxies that have brought so much terror to Israel and a very difficult quagmire that we find ourselves in now.
My wife and I went to Israel right after Christmas and saw firsthand the horrible barbarism that happened on October 7th, and are fully supportive of Israel doing what it must do to eradicate Hamas and destroy that threat. I'm not going to comment on what Israel should do in terms of dealing with Hezbollah. I have much more confidence in their ability to decide what's best for Israel as a democracy. What I will say is that they are absolutely being attacked from all sides by these proxies that are underwritten by Iran. And the original sin, the thing that put us in this position, was President Obama's deal in 2015 to give back $100 billion of sanctioned money. And the deciding vote on that was Bob Casey, and that my opponent in the Senate race. And that money is being used to underwrite terrorist groups, the Houthis, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, and of course, Hamas. And we're going to have to deal with that. Israel's going to have to deal with that. And a final point, this is not just a war against Israel. This is very much directed at the West. And sadly, it's raising the risk for Americans around the world and in the Middle East. Yeah.
Let me ask you this from another angle, though, Dave, as we wait for a possible ceasefire and you look at the destruction that has been wrought in Gaza, more than 30,000 civilians killed, according to the Gaza Health Ministry. At what point is the response disproportionate?
Yeah, well, listen, I obviously watch the same clips you do. When you see human suffering and innocent people injured or killed, it's heartbreaking. The source of this pain is Hamas, that has integrated itself into the civilian population. Their explicit strategy is to increase civilian casualties. And Israel certainly has every right to eradicate the risks that destroyed the lives of 1,200 Israelis. Hopefully we're going to be able to find resolution on that soon. I think it's very difficult to imagine Israel letting a military capability continue with Hamas. And so I'll leave it to them to figure out the best timing and path for that. But obviously, I was very gratified to see all the efforts that are being put in place to allow humanitarian corridors, to allow as much humanitarian support as possible into Gaza. And it's absolutely heartbreaking to see not only what happened on October 7th, but to see innocents killed in Gaza. But make no mistake, the root of this, the root cause, the source of this evil, and the culpable party is Hamas.
Dave, before we let you go here, I do want to get your thoughts on the U.S. election this cycle here, especially because you yourself are also on the campaign trail and going around the country looking for fresh donors, new fundraising. What is it about Donald Trump that Wall Street finds attractive at this point? Because we know that even those who have shied away after January 6th, some of them have come back in the fundraising circuit. What is it that they're latching on to?
Well, I think the primary thing is that the country's just going in a really bad direction, and most Americans see it. So the economy I talked about, there's certainly positive economic factors, but for 60% of Americans, they're living paycheck to paycheck, and compounded inflation is really driven, and higher prices have really made it much harder for them to make ends meet. You see it with the border crisis, 10 million illegal migrants coming into the country, a huge national security risk, a huge fentanyl risk. You see this in which we just talked about, the war on oil and gas, which is particularly a big deal for Pennsylvania and many states across our great country. So I think the policies President Biden are taking us in a terrible direction. And I think that people compare the policies of President Trump with the policies of President Biden and say, you know what, we were better off and our future was much brighter under the leadership of President Trump. I think that's what's happening. That's certainly what's happening on the ground in Pennsylvania. And I'm running as someone who's an independent voice, someone who will fight for the interest of Pennsylvanians, someone who's led in the military, led and created jobs in Pennsylvania, led companies, and someone who can get into the Senate and make a real difference and be a real advocate for policies that help Pennsylvanians.